What an intro. Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking the Scientific Committee for letting me speak here today. This event is turning out to be every bit as innovative and inspiring as I hoped it would be, or indeed maybe I should say as we all hoped it would be. Really fantastic to be here. I have started with the slide of many logos. I'm here today to represent both I4 and the ICAM coalition. ICAM is the International Companion Animal Management Coalition, and all of the members are represented by the logos along the bottom there. So, as Bernie said, I'm going to talk about dog population management today. So I'm going to start just by putting that whole DPM thing within the human behaviour context. So when we look at a stray dog population, we know that normally the majority of them are going to be owned roaming. So they have a referral household, a referral family that allows them free rein for at least part of the day. Some of them are going to be like this chap here, who's being dumped on Los Mascotas Beach in Puerto Rico. He's an abandoned owned dog, so a very clear human behaviour source to this dog. And then we have our classic sort of unowned dog. So here's your classic sandy-coloured Indian street dog. Now these guys might not have a single referral household, but they're often provided food by a number of people. So a community dog is a more commonly used term. There might be other people who don't tolerate these dogs very well. So you have these sort of conflicting human behaviours that are going to impact on their welfare, their reproductive success, and their longevity. The other thing that I wanted to clarify about my talk today is I'm not going to talk about how to change human behaviour. There are far more expert people here today than me. What I'm going to talk about is how you monitor change in human behaviour over time. So if we look at that project cycle, I'm focusing on the blue text. So not least that final stage of evaluation where you're using the data collected through monitoring to establish lessons learned and then sort of plough that back into redesigning and evolving the project. So you can do a proper adaptive management cycle. Now I'm going to make a little plug for this document here. This was published by ICAM last year, so it's a guide to monitoring and evaluating DPM interventions. It's got quite a bit on how you can measure human behaviour as it relates to DPM. And it provides a list of several potential indicators against 8 commonly stated impacts of DPM. And for each of those indicators, it gives at least one method of measurement and some detailed advice on how to implement that method. Most DPM interventions won't be aiming to achieve all 8 impacts. So there's also this interactive tool on the website. It asks you a series of questions about your dogs, about your intervention. Based on your answers, it'll provide you with a guidance document that's been tailored to you, including only those indicators and methods that appear to be most suitable to your reality. So do check it out if you're interested in dog population management. Okay, so we've established that human behaviour has a very significant impact on dog populations, and the classic way that that happens is through the care provided to an owned dog, or indeed the care provided to community dogs. So what we have up here is I4's definition of adequate guardianship. So these are the human behaviours required to keep that dog in an acceptable state of welfare. So we've got the needs of the dogs sort of categorised there under 3 subtitles: the resources they need, the environmental conditions, social interactions, and you need a guardian, a person or persons that are going to make sure these are provided in the long term. So the question is, how do we know what level of guardianship is currently being performed in our communities? So the classic way that we do this is by using questionnaires. And we've got a couple of examples up there, one from Chile, one from Taiwan, and also an example of a study where they used participatory methods. Michelle Mortis did this in Bali, Indonesia. And they used methods of visualization and ranking to establish the feeding practices of both owned dogs and community dogs. Now, the thing about those 3 examples is that they're establishing human behaviour at a particular point in time, and what we're interested in is how behaviour changes over time. So we have fewer examples of this. Here's just a couple. One was a questionnaire that was repeated both pre- and post-intervention in Thailand, and they saw a significant increase in the percentage of owned dogs that were adopted from the streets, a particular behaviour they wanted to see increase. And there's also an example that's going on at the moment, which is in Bosnia, where I4 have a project called Humane Community Development, where you gather a multitude of stakeholders together and get them to explore their own problems within their community and design an intervention themselves. So they're very much the leaders and creators of their own intervention. And I'm going to use that project as an example throughout this talk. Part of that is we are running knowledge, attitude and practice surveys, and we're using phone apps just to make it a bit more efficient in terms of data collection, data transfer and analysis. So we're conducting baseline surveys in each of those communities, and importantly we have a commitment to repeat those surveys a year after the intervention has started and regularly thereafter. One other thing about those CAP surveys is they do also include some animal-based indicators of welfare and care, so similar to what Sadeki was describing in Ethiopia. So we're looking at the owned dogs themselves, recording their body condition, their skin condition, and also recording a particular aspect of care that we're concerned about in Bosnia, which is tethering. So quite a large proportion of the owned dogs are tethered 24 hours a day, which is of course a concern for dog welfare. But what I've talked about so far is about measuring actual behaviour, and we're quite interested really in that process of behaviour change, where it's working, where it's not. So not just is the behaviour changing, but why and how, and are there any barriers that we have yet not addressed through our intervention? So if we go back to this definition of adequate guardianship, we can see there are many human behaviours involved in keeping this dog in a decent state of welfare, and to explore all of those would probably just be too time consuming. So my suggestion is pulling out key human behaviours from this description here, based on the community, choose the best one for that community and explore those in more detail. So for example, for Bosnia, we're concerned about this 24-hour tethering of dogs. For a project like Bali that Kate described earlier today, we might be interested in exploring the behaviour of making the time and effort to get your dog vaccinated against rabies. So you pick those particular behaviours and then you explore them in more detail. Now, this is where our questionnaires start to let us down a bit. They don't really have the depth that we need, and so you start to move to more qualitative methods. So you can use just simply extended sort of semi-structured interviews, and you could do that at the end of your CAP survey. So just for a subsample of people, you ask if you can stay on for another 30 minutes or so and talk to them in more detail about that key behaviour that you're interested in. You could also conduct that with focus groups. So for example, you could establish a small group of hunters or rural farmers or urban pet owners, and again use these sort of semi-structured interviews to explore in more detail the knowledge that are underlying their behaviours, their attitudes, any barriers to behaviour change. And this is also where we can start to put in those participatory methods. So ranking is a good example of one. Say if you had a focus group that had listed a number of barriers to a particular behaviour that you hoped they would perform, you can use ranking to get them to order those in terms of importance, and potentially also in terms of how easily they think those barriers could be lifted. And Sharing the Load's got some really good examples of this. For example, the animal welfare practice gap analysis is a good exercise to do this with. I also want to mention most significant change as a methodology. So that's a method of collating stories and selecting the best stories that represent the behaviour change that you're hoping to see. I won't go into any more detail about it. There's a great guide online that you can download and take a look at. Suffice to say, it's kind of quite a fun methodology to use for monitoring and evaluation. You get a good story, your hair stands on end, and rarely do you get that from the data point from a CAP survey. So this is one of the really fun ones. I have also so far sort of focused on the behaviour of your beneficiary, or indeed the owner and carer of your beneficiary. But what about your change agent themselves? So if we go back to that Bosnia example, we have U4 and United Nations Development Programme are the managing partner within the country. The beneficiaries are the dogs, or the dog owners and carers. But what about these guys in the middle? So these are our sort of local change agent, our local partner, and in this case it's this community group, this sort of multi-stakeholder community group that's come together to try and tackle dogs in their community. So what we're trying to do in Bosnia is that every time this group comes together for a sort of more formalised workshop, which happens regularly but not frequently, we then use a survey to try and explore their perceptions and their beliefs and so on around dogs and how they work as a group. So we ask them about social pressure on how they behave with dogs. And we also ask them about their social capital. So social capital, you could define that as someone's level of engagement and enjoyment of their community. So we present them with a series of statements and ask them for their level of agreement with those. So I regularly participate in community activities is a statement about someone's social capital. But we also ask them about how dogs impact on their social capital. So I avoid visiting some people because of roaming dogs in their area. And the graph that you see behind this, the blue is the number of people that agreed with a positive statement and disagreed with a negative one. The red are people agreeing with negative statements and disagreeing with positive ones. So what we want to see over time is we hope that these communities move more into the blue. And what we're really interested in is to see whether their behaviour as a community, their interactions with each other in the group and their engagement with the intervention, whether that also correlates with how their perceptions are changing as well. So just to sort of finish with those learning points, planning for monitoring and evaluation sounds rather obvious really, but that really needs to be done from the outset so we can establish some baselines for human behaviour at the beginning. You do need a relatively significant financial commitment to that, in that questionnaires, which we're still classically reliant on, are relatively time-consuming to implement, and you're going to need to do them at least twice, if not more frequently. I'd also suggest doing a public commitment, doing some human behaviour change within your team as well. So you say very clearly to each other, we are going to do this on a regular basis. We are going to measure these behaviours. You could even consider maybe making a public commitment to the wider community as well, to say that you are going to track behaviour over time and you're serious about seeing whether the intervention is working. Although there are potentially risks about stated behaviour versus actual behaviour when you go to ask those people, how are you looking after their dogs? They may have more of an idea than you expect as to what you want them to say. It's a potential risk there. I would recommend that you make monitoring and evaluation a very clear responsibility of somebody senior. It's such an easy job to drop off the to-do list, so you want to make sure that it's up there somewhere. And we really need to make this long term. So if we talk about having a financial commitment to monitoring and evaluation, that should last after the intervention has completed. If we're talking about sustained behaviour change, ideally we want to be going back years after we've left to see if it's still in place. And I think you would have heard that Jeff mentioned earlier today sort of intergenerational change. So we're talking potentially about really quite long-term change. When we're looking at measuring change in behaviour, we are still quite reliant on questionnaires, boring though they may be. That is a relatively reliable methodology to lean on at the moment. Or there are some innovative methods going on, and Brooke in particular have been exploring some good ways of exploring people's behaviour without having to use the standard questionnaire. But also there's participatory methods that we can start to lean on. And there's a nice report by Chambers who describes ways of using participatory methodologies to establish quantitative data about how people are behaving. When we start to look at that process of behaviour change, we need to start looking at more qualitative methodologies. And they can be quite time-consuming, so this is when we want to start selecting key behaviours that are particularly relevant for the community in question. Monitoring and evaluation is for learning. Please don't leave it to the end. The point is that you do it throughout the project lifespan and you're constantly adapting and improving as you go. So just one practical way of hopefully making that happen is to make, again, this sort of public commitment to, within your project team, and potentially also to the wider community, to what's called an evaluation event. So that's a time when everybody in the team's Downs tools comes together, looks at the data that's being collected through monitoring, interprets, learns from that, and then plows those learnings back into your project planning so that you can evolve and improve what you're doing over time. Now, if you make a commitment to that months, if not years ahead of time, commit budget and time to those events, the people that are responsible for collecting data are far less likely to allow that to drop off the to-do list, because you've said you're going to use it in April 2017. That data better be there. You're also more likely to find that people will prioritise the time and brain space to come to these evaluation events. So they need to come ready to celebrate if the data shows their intervention is working. They also need to come with open minds so that if they see that the data shows the behaviour change is not happening as they expected, they can be innovative and try and evolve the project further. I'm just going to finish with a few resources. 3 of these I've mentioned already. The one in bold I haven't. That was quite a good read in terms of it gives some concrete examples of measuring human behaviour change in human development projects. And that's in that particular example is from Australia. And then finally, just to cue the cute quizzical puppy photo, which is I'm very happy to answer questions if the chair allows me to, and I'll say thank you for listening.